Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. Our top story tonight is about the continuing woes of Kashmir, a land occupied by India and illegally annexed in August last year. India has been at pains since that illegal annexation to sell a white lie to the world, i.e. that its action was an internal administrative move, and B, that it was done in the best interests of Kashmiris. Since then, despite much effort by India, the world seems to have seen through the lie. Life in Kashmir remains at a virtual standstill. The economy continues to suffer. Kashmiris continue to be killed and arrested. Sham local elections are conducted to show the world that Kashmiris are expressing their democratic will. Let me, before I get to our panel tonight, give the viewers some idea of what's happening. Now, a 28 December analysis by Ryan Nakash, and he talks about this sponsored visit that the Indian government managed for some foreign journalists. Now, they have been trying to do this before also, but this was to embed a small group of foreign journalists in the contentious District Development Council elections. And these journalists, nonetheless, were disallowed from freely visiting any part of Kashmir without a police escort, and meetings were pre-arranged largely with government officials, members of the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party, and other individuals seemingly approved of by the government and its agencies. Now, despite this, the Financial Times, for instance, opened its report with a first-time voter identified as Muhammad Afzal in North Kashmir, and said rather than exercising his political free will, Mr. Afzal was casting the first ballot of his life out of fear. This is Financial Times. This is not a Kashmiri paper, this is not a Pakistani paper, this is a Western paper. FT further reported, and again I quote, according to the BJP, the polls are proof that normalcy is returning to the valley, with each vote a tacit endorsement of the abrogation of 370, the article of the Indian Constitution that gave the Jammu and Kashmir region limited autonomy. But this is anathema to Kashmiris who say they are being subjugated by Mr. Modi's government. As I said, this is the Financial Times. The FT report noted the shadow and surveillance of government forces over the elections and the foreign correspondents' coverage. At some polling stations, there were, and again, this is FT, twice as many soldiers as there were voters. Furthermore, FT reported that 6 troops formed a ring around a voter who told the Financial Times, for now the fight is about 370, but the ultimate goal is freedom from India, unquote. Now, the New York Times chose to open with these lines. And this is a quote from the New York Times, the US newspaper. Votes were counted on Tuesday in the first local elections in Kashmir since the Indian government waged a harsh political and security crackdown in the restive region last year. Officials hailed a solid turnout as a sign that democracy has been restored, but little in Kashmir feels normal. The region's chief secretary, BVR Subramaniam, was quoted by the New York Times as having said that the voting shows democracy being alive at the grassroots. People taking value of their own lives is visible, palpable. The report, however, deconstructed this claim with an assortment of facts. And this is the New York Times. There was democracy in Kashmir previously, but with abrogation, it was trampled upon. As Muhammad Bhatt, identified as an independent candidate in Bandipora as part of the People's Alliance, told the New York Times. He was further quoted as saying, "We have united to bring back the special status." For Reuters, Fayaz Bukhari talks about the fact that India's government detained at least 75 Kashmiri political leaders and activists to forestall political unrest after an alliance of Kashmir's regional political parties won local election leaders, and this is, he's talking about the various leaders and the police officials talking to him. The district council election concluded early this week was the first such exercise since Narendra Modi's government last year revoked the special status of Indian-controlled region. New Delhi then cracked down on the opposition and rounded up hundreds of people to preempt protests and violence. Al Jazeera and TRT World report Indian police on Sunday accused an army officer and 2 associates of planting weapons on the bodies of 3 laborers killed in Kashmir to make it look as though they were armed fighters. And this was done in a staged gun battle. And this was in July this year. Under AFSPA, which is the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, an emergency law applied in Kashmir since 1990, when an armed rebellion erupted against Indian rule, Indian soldiers deployed in the region cannot be tried in a civilian court unless New Delhi agrees. No such permission has ever been granted during the last 30 years, despite dozens of requests by the police after investigations into actions by the security forces. This is about the Indian occupation forces in occupied and illegally annexed Kashmir. Human rights activists in Kashmir point out that in the past, army has killed many civilians in staged gun battle after terming them rebels to claim monetary benefits and medals. This is not new. That's the point. In 2010, a police investigation revealed the army killed 3 civilians in a staged gun battle in Machal area near the line of control in Kupwara district. The 3 civilians were lured to Machal and killed there before being labeled militants by the army. Let me remind the viewers that an inquiry established that this happened, but the military tribunal absolved the culprits of this. So this is not even the tip of the iceberg. This is nothing. I mean, there's much more happening and has happened than just this. And this has been, I understand that, this has been a somewhat long intro, but it's important to put things in perspective and juxtapose them with the brazen-faced lies India continues to tell the world. But let's get to our panel. I am joined by Gowher Geelani, a Kashmiri journalist and author of the book Kashmir, Rage and Reason, and Ambassador Arif Kamal, a former Pakistani diplomat and a Kashmiri. Let me get to Mr. Geelani first. Mr. Geelani, as I said, that this was a somewhat long introduction, but I just wanted to put some facts on the ground based on reports by foreigners. Give us a sense of what the situation is.
Well, I wish that other people in your part of the world also, did some research before saying things, and so as to do justice with analysis. But I will point out, with these DDC elections for the district development councils, it was a double-edged sword. Like, for example, I'll tell you the argument put forth by the People's Alliance for Gupkar Declaration was that if they boycotted this election like they did the during the panchayat elections, so what would have happened that even this institution, which is like politically nothing, which cannot alter anything politically, but even these smaller institutions would have gone into BJP's kitty once they would have been boycotted. Second thing is that once they did, it also sort of normalized the August 5 decisions of 2019. So these are the two arguments in favor and against the participation in the DDC elections. But having said that, what I want to point out is that you have to understand in what atmosphere and under which environment these elections were conducted. One, it was a militarized exercise. There was militarization. All major political parties, the leaders of all major political parties, including former Chief Minister Mehbooba Mufti, was detained. She was placed under house arrest. Forget about what they did with the Hurriyat conference or the other political parties, ideological forces. But even those who have believed in the Constitution of India, they were treated like as if they were demanding independence or merger with Pakistan or even the caliphate. So that was the atmosphere in which these elections were conducted. Second thing was that still for the last 16 months we are without high-speed 4G internet, and what is the scenario of the development that they are talking about so much. So despite having conducted this exercise under a militarized atmosphere, there was unprecedented participation in the Jammu province, like Udhampur, Riyasi, and other Rajouri, Poonch, Doda. But in the Kashmir Valley, the numbers, overall numbers, were presented as if that entire population in Jammu and Kashmir, or the entire electorate, had participated, which is not a fact. There are, in South Kashmir, for example, I want to give you the factual representation. In South Kashmir's Pulwama and Shupayan district, in all the 8 phases, the percentage voter turnout was within single digits. It was like 6%, sometimes 5%, sometimes 8%. It was mostly in single digits. It never touched 2 digit in these 2 districts. And in other parts of Kashmir, the overall, it remained between 22%, 25%, and 31%. But once the participation in the Jammu province was 70%, and they, when they take out the mean and average, it came out that more than 50% participated in the entire region. So that was another context. Third thing that you mentioned about this recent case wherein an army officer and his 2 associates have been sort of indicted in the killing of 3 innocent youth from Rajouri who had gone to work in Shopaya, and they were dubbed as militants. It's not the first case. These are 3 big reported cases which we know about. One is Chetty Singhpura, a Patribal case. Similarly, 5 laborers were killed in fake encounter, or the Matsil that you mentioned in your intro, or this latest one in Shopaya about the Rajouri youth. These are the reported cases, and human rights organizations here say that there are more cases which go unreported because they're out of fear. People do not report such cases. So that is another thing that has to be kept in mind. And these exercises of calling, like you rightly mentioned about Financial Times or New York Times, these embedded journalism that they try to do by bringing in foreign journalists, parachuting them so as to show them that this DDC exercise was sort of democratic exercise, but it turned out that they ended up showing some parts of the ground reality by writing what they did. But the important thing is that this was not the first attempt. BJP is always allergic to third-party mediation or having foreign intervention of any sort. But if you remember last year also, when they revoked Kashmir's semi-autonomy and statehood, they brought the far-right leadership, far-right diplomats from European countries. And also then the second delegation was brought here, and they tried to sell normalcy, by making them meet the only officials in the administration and bureaucracy and some, stooges and opportunists. So that is the overall scenario. But I think, as far as an ordinary Kashmiri is concerned, he or she is left with little options because the world is sort of silent, and no relief is coming from any quarter. So they don't know what to do because they are, as it's a dispossessed and marginalized population.
Thank you, Mr. As always. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons in my intro I did not mention your tweets because I was following them through these DDC elections, and because I knew that you were on the panel and you will explain the situation as also the dilemma that you talked about. And as a matter of fact, as you talked about this far-right MEPs delegation that was brought, I was actually writing it down because this was done by this mysterious Srivastava group, which has also been blamed by the EU disinformation lab as having run this disinformation campaign against Pakistan, and a fraudulent campaign. But stay with me, Mr. Geelani. Let me bring in Ambassador Kamal. Ambassador Kamal, we know that it's going to be a long haul, but as Mr. Geelani said, and he has expressed this before also on this program, a sense of despondence building up in Kashmir, marginalization, a sense that, the world doesn't care much about it. Now, in that, Pakistan obviously is at the cutting edge of the political diplomatic offensive against these Indian moves. As a former diplomat, give me your sense of whether you're satisfied with what Pakistan has done so far, and is there anything more that we can do?
Well, Pakistan could do in as much as it is unheard these days, but I think the situation as it exists in the valley has already made a dent in the public opinion arenas across the globe, which is manifest, say, first of all, from the two reports that have come up from the United Nations Human Rights Commission and its echoes, which we still hear. The next in line, whatever comes from the Genocide Watch, I think ought to be also seen very closely and also strategize as to what Kashmiri people can do next. I think the OIC meeting last held in Niger also brings testimony to the fact that whatsoever was the slumber, we find the Ummah, if it is something that we may name as such, has started speaking once again. But I think your question is well taken. But I think what is most important is the position that the principal party takes in the tribunal, and that is the Kashmiri people themselves. Kashmiri street, whether passive or active in either of the two situations, is closely monitored. And I think the rejection of August 5 has been too manifest on the street, and also whatsoever Mr. Geelani very elegantly presented about the electoral process. Of course, the electoral process did not have many political connotations ipso facto, but the rejection of August 5 was total in the valley. And it was also quite reasonably high in the Jammu region. And I think this is quite noticeable. And when they brought in the journalists only yesterday, or day before yesterday, they made a point that their contact with the common man is not that intimate. And I think international press already reported on that.
So I get you, Ambassador Kamal. Let me interject here. Now, here's the thing. We do know that India feels troubled. India is very unhappy with the world's response. So that means that, it hurts. But there is still a distance to go because essentially it's the Western governments that need to respond to what's happening. Now, the Prime Minister of Pakistan has said very clearly, and this is also reflected in the YC Foreign Minister's declaration, that Kashmiris are a party to this. Now, do you think it would be in the best interest of what we are trying to do here to actually declare that it's not a dispute primarily between India and Pakistan, but it's a dispute about Kashmiri's right to self-determination, and that it's a political movement which Pakistan recognizes, and from there on begin to support it in that way. That kind of changes the sort of direction of this struggle, because India constantly talks about it pushes the Kashmiris to the back burner and talks about this being a dispute with Pakistan.
Sure, I think the fault lines that have existed over 7 decades only relate to overactive role by the parties concerned. I think the principal party has to be given a very clear face and a very clear voice, and that is the only way we can move forward. And it has to be institutionalized and by the Kashmiris themselves. And the friends across the globe must pay attention to that voice and that face, and also see how this question that relates to human dynamics and not to a territorial dispute between two competitors has to be advanced further. I think I get the sense of the question, and that is my take on that.
Right. Thank you. That was Ambassador Arif Kamal speaking with us. Let me go back to Mr. Geelani. Mr. Geelani, just going back to these staged killings and false flag operations, as a matter of fact, it's very interesting that a U.S. Military officer, Colonel David Smith, who has compiled a book on what's known as the Wellington Experience, which is the Indian military's staff college. And in that, one of his findings has to do with Kashmir, how these occupation forces act in Kashmir. And it's very clear in that finding that there is a policy, that's what he says, there's a policy of going for these staged killings. So I think this is something that can be built upon in terms of the previous findings in Machal also, these findings, the Shopian ones, and what Dave Smith says. Do you think there's sort of, enough here to actually agitate this issue in a way that really brings out the ugly face of this policy in Kashmir?
Oh, well, Mr. Heather, I think there's one very exhaustive book which is written by Keshalya Bhattacharya. Its name is Blood on My Hands. It is basically about these staged encounters, not only in Kashmir, but also in the Northeast, Assam and other, Northeast states. And it's a very detailed, very exhaustive book, which is actually based on confessions of an Indian Army officer. And he explains in the book that how they, sort of kill these immigrants who come from Bangladesh and settle down in Assam or neighboring northeastern states, and then how, because they are like sort of lifeless and nobody has a claim over their bodies because they are poor, they come from poorer backgrounds, and once they come to Assam or other states for work, they're already homeless. And by the time their bodies are sold and they are killed in staged encounters, nobody claims their bodies, and they remain. That's why no investigations take place. So that is one aspect of it. But I think these cases are very, very well known, from Patribal to Madhil to the latest one in Shupaya. What hope they have and what expectations they have from a dispossessed population, which is roughly 8 million, 80 lakh people who are, who are living in tough conditions, where media is gagged, where civil liberties are suspended, where everything is under military control. My previous guest, learned guest, was talking about the UN reports or other these reports from other countries, Western countries. It actually doesn't help the situation on the ground, because as I told you last time also in these programs, that the facts on the ground are changing so fast that there are fears in Kashmir that in 5 years a Muslim majority character of the Jammu and Kashmir region may not be there. These are the fears about domicile, demography, and dignity. Those are the real concerns that people have in Kashmir.
I'm going to get back to you, Mr. Geelani, because that's a very important point. And as I said earlier also, that this is a point that you've made on this program. But I'm also now joined by Ravale Mohydin, who's a writer and researcher at TRT World Research Center. Ravale, thank you for being on the program. We're discussing, of course, the situation in occupied and illegally annexed Kashmir. I, in fact, referred to one of the reports by TRT World also with reference to the sham district council elections, as also the extrajudicial killings that happened in July, and the findings that there was an Indian Army officer responsible for those. But Gowher Geelani essentially is making a very important point, which is that the situation on the ground in Kashmir is changing very fast, and they feel marginalized. And so, because you are at the TRT World Research Center, I want to ask you, what is your sense of how the world is looking at the situation increasingly? Is there a sense out there that India is trying to market a white lie, and the situation is completely different from what India projects it to be?
One thing which I feel is not being understood over here is the fact that India has always been selling a narrative about the Kashmir issue. What they've done is since a very long time, they have been peddling this narrative about how Kashmir is not an indigenous struggle. Kashmir is only a struggle because of Pakistan, and Pakistan is supporting so-called terrorists in Kashmir trying to destabilize not just Kashmir but also India. Now, this particular narrative has been sold for a very long time, but also picked up speed post 9/11, when the Muslims being terrorists, Muslims being militants, that picked up in Western news media. And that was built upon by the Indian news media and how Indian government or media narratives anywhere in the world. Now, so far, they were able to push that narrative for whatever reason, whether it was building on Western narratives about Muslims or whether that was because it was helping their agenda. After 1990, they were the Special Powers Act, Special Protection for the armed forces, Indian armed forces came into being for Jammu and Kashmir. And since then, the Indian Army officers could go to any length to discredit Kashmiri civilians or Kashmiri activists, even killing them and targeting them as militants. And the Indian news media kind of pushed that narrative also. Now, unfortunately for them, the world is unable to reconcile what the media narrative is, what India's narrative is about Kashmir, as well as the reality on the ground. They are unable to understand why is it that if the region was actually so peaceful, why do they have to basically muzzle 8.5, 9 million people? Why do they have to keep them in the dark? Why do they have to make sure that they are not?
So you're basically saying that. So you're basically saying that there is now a realization that there is a huge discrepancy between what the Indian narrative is and what the reality on the ground is.
There's a huge discrepancy, and you cannot ignore it anymore. You cannot say that, oh my God, there is no problem, when in fact India itself. You have to understand that it's highly unusual this investigation is even taking place. This is actually a part of the conversation even in India. It's highly unusual. Indian Army officers are actually rewarded for killing so-called militants. So the fact that this is actually happening, you have to understand how extreme the suppression is right now for it to leak out in such ways. This is something that they cannot contain. The world cannot ignore it. They cannot contain it, even within their own country. So, it's not just, it's something which is out of their hands now.
Right. And I have to wrap up also quickly back to Gowher Geelani. Gowher Geelani, there is definitely something out there that's changing. All I will say is that perhaps you need to have, and I know how difficult it is, I know how grim the situation on the ground is, but I would say that perhaps you need to have a little more faith in the fact that what's being done by India is something that the world has begun to understand, and that they will react to it.
I think, with my participation in many of your programs, that I am a very optimist person, on a personal, thing. But you actually have to realize that how bad the situation is in Kashmir. It's like, telling someone who is captured, who is a captive in Auschwitz, and telling them that the world is listening to you. There may come a day when you will be out of your concentration camp. Even then, I know that people have to have faith, because people have to search, for meanings in their lives when there is utter darkness everywhere. But I was giving you a sense that how ordinary Kashmiris are feeling. I may be feeling differently. I may analyze the geopolitical situation, the changing situation around the globe. But it's about the ordinary Kashmiris, how they are feeling, how dejected they are, how they're also how India is actually changing facts on the ground on a very, very fast pace. And that is the concern that I repeatedly, say in your program, that it's about demography, dignity, and the Muslim majority character of the state. And you have no idea that how all the institutions, including the human rights groups, they have all been wiped out. There is nothing, you heard about Amnesty International, but even the groups in Kashmir, their laptops, everything is seized. They're all non-existent. Nothing comes out from the ground. Even pro-India political leaders are detained. You can imagine how bad the situation is.
No, I can definitely, Mr. Geelani, as someone who keeps a close watch on these things, I perfectly understand and I hear you loud and clear. And I am always very happy when you talk about this with the candidness that you do. It's very important for our viewers to hear that. So thank you so much for that. That was Mr. Gowher Geelani. Thank you also to Ravale Mohydin for her thoughts. We shall take a short break and return to discuss a decision by Bangladesh to relocate a second batch of Rohingya, a Muslim minority, to a remote island in the Bay of Bengal. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Let's get to our second story. Bangladesh moved a second group of Rohingya refugees to a low-lying island in the Bay of Bengal today. Reuters had reported the story yesterday. The move comes amidst calls by rights groups to stop the relocation on safety grounds. More than 1,100 Rohingya refugees will be moved from a refugee camp near the Myanmar border to Bhasan Char Island. Authorities moved the first batch of more than 1,600 early this month. Humanitarian agencies and rights groups have criticized the relocation, saying the island, hours by boat from the mainland, is flood-prone, vulnerable to frequent cyclones, and could be completely submerged during a high tide. Bangladesh says it is only transferring people who are willing to go, and the relocation will ease chronic overcrowding in camps that are home to more than 1 million Rohingya. Let's get to our panel to discuss the situation, including the reasons behind Dhaka's decision for relocation. We are joined by Asif Munier, who's a Bangladeshi analyst and journalist, and Dr. David Richards, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Connecticut. Professor Richards is also associated with the university's Human Rights Institute. Let me quickly go to Mr. Munier because he's on the ground. Mr. Munier, give us a sense of why this is happening and, of course, the criticism that this has begotten.
I think the government from the Bangladesh side has a point to prove, in the sense that this is, again, perhaps a tryout in terms of one temporary solution, although the permanent solution is on the issue of the political level and diplomatic level. But in terms of the community response that's needed for the Rohingyas, and again, it's among the large population that's there. It's only a small number that they're only talking about. And the first criticism that came up last few years, actually, about that it's flood prone and cyclone, the government is very clearly saying that has been addressed. So I would say that in terms of the infrastructure issues, and especially the criticism about it, that has been to some extent resolved. Of course, we have to see over a period of time, especially the monsoon season next year. That will be a test of the actual sort of provisions that have been made. But they're very certain that it has been addressed. What has not been yet looked into, or it may take a longer time, is the social cost and also the political and the security issues. I mean, there are quite a few of these issues already in the Cox's Bazar, where it's very overcrowded, and tensions between the local community and the Rohingyas, and inner conflicts within the Rohingya groups, vested interest groups. Several issues are there. So we don't know how much of that will also be carried on with the population, with all the things that happen in Cox's Bazar to Bhashanchar. So there are still questions that are unanswered. But of course, the different divisions between the UN agencies, the UN human rights groups, and the Bangladesh government, there is a standoff. But I think this time, especially in the the repatriation or the move for this time, there has been less sort of more open conflict or open criticism of the process, because the government is going ahead with it no matter what. So it remains to be seen how much they're successful.
Right. My own sense is, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the criticism has to do with the issues of safety. Now, you talked about the infrastructure development and the rest of it, but I'm assuming that there would be data with reference to the island and how what happens during high tides and in terms of cyclones and the rest of it. And I'm assuming that the rights groups are actually focusing on this issue on the basis of that data.
Yes, but there are different kinds of data, and the government has their own data, and the other agencies and human rights groups, they have their own data. So it's not very clear that which data you can really rely on. So what I'm saying is that, of course, it is at the risk of the actual people who are down there. The real issue would be to see and observe what happens in the coming year. Of course, there are data in terms of that, yes, the land came up in the last 20 years, or slightly, more so in the last 10 years or so. But there hasn't been any major cyclone, not just for this particular island, but around that region. We haven't been affected. Bangladesh has not been affected in a major scale from any kind of natural disasters in the recent years. So that doesn't really say much. So right. Yes, the risk is still there, but I would still say that the social issues, because this is completely a different location, different district. Although it's an island, it's definitely a different scenario than Cox's Bazar. Not just being an island, it's within a different geographic area. It's within another administrative region, and that's why the relocation is actually two-way process. First taken to another district, and then transported by naval ships. So it's quite an expensive and a huge undertaking. It's only 2,000 or about 3,000 who have been moved now, but they're targeting 100,000, and that's going to take quite a bit of time and resources.
Right. I hear you. There are issues, and the situation is pretty complex. But let me pull in Dr. Richards here. Professor Richards, what is your reading of this?
I tend to agree with the rights groups in that it seems to be a humanitarian disaster in the making. What I understand is that the Bangladeshi government has spec'd out 40 beds, hospital beds for 100,000 persons, which is inadequate. And in terms of medical emergencies, people would have to be taken to the mainland, which is a 3-hour boat ride. And my understanding of the use of the Navy ships is because of the pirates in the area. That's the only safe passage through those waters. And this ties into some complaints by the Rohingya that they're lacking freedom of movement, that they're kind of prisoners on this island because they don't have a way for safe passage to the mainland. Also in terms of storm surges and things like that, typically people from the area go to the mainland during these times, and the Rohingya believe that they're not going to have the opportunity to do that, that they've been cut off from education, that they've been cut off from jobs. They're not going to have the government ID cards that the citizens have. And in terms of the data about what's going on the island, I think the specific frustration from the UN and the rights groups is that they haven't been allowed to go and see for themselves. They would like to go and see for themselves how the rhetoric from the Bangladeshi government meets the reality of the structures on the island. They're worried that they're putting these people on a new accretion that in an area where 40% of the storm surges in the world take place. It's very dangerous, and I don't think anybody would doubt that. And the other thing that's important too is that the Bangladeshi government has tried to partner with NGOs for, say, food assistance and basic services assistance. And some of these NGOs are reporting that they can't get donors for activities on the island because the donors don't want to fund the relocation. And so some of the basic services and foods supplies are not happening.
Right. Now, here's the thing. Bangladesh, obviously, it depends on how you slicing or dicing the situation and from which angle. And of course, Bangladesh can be criticized for a number of reasons, as it is being criticized. But the real central problem here is Myanmar. Now, I want to know what exactly is happening with reference to the Myanmar government, which has actually created this problem.
As far as I know, there's no real action pushing Myanmar on this issue. And I wonder whether, I wonder whether really that's a central point in terms of what's happening with the relocation, because as the previous speaker noted, it's in process. A few thousand people have already moved. They're looking to put 100,000 persons there, which leaves 900,000, I think, in Cox's Bazar. If anything, Myanmar should be helping with this. They're not, right? As you said, they've created the situation and washed their hands of it. I don't see anything really happening with Myanmar. So I think it, has fallen on Bangladesh, and they're in a tough situation. Having 1 million people, 1 million refugees is tough. My curiosity is why they won't let foreign journalists in the UN and the rights groups come to the island.
Okay.
If they've made it safe, then it should be safe for international verification.
Right.
So it seems that, maybe they're creating suspicion where maybe they didn't have to. That's really, to me, the question.
Okay, right. So let me get Munier on this. Mr. Munier, Professor Richards has made several points. I would like to get your take on them.
Thank you. First, I think about Myanmar, yes, it's very right that there has not been much move. And if I can say from allies for the Rohingyas as well as Bangladesh, I think the attempts have been made more at the UN level to bring it at the Security Council or during the General Assembly, or there are different committee meetings, but it has not really been sort of got any results out of that. I mean, okay, some resolutions, but say for the Security Council, there has been sort of divided opinions. So that level, not much. In terms of bilateral, that has been sort of a lost case right from the beginning, Myanmar and Bangladesh, the bilateral process. So it started in 2017, zero result from that, and false promises from the Myanmar side. And regarding sort of different other platforms, for instance, the OIC, which made the move for the, process at the International Court of Justice, with Gambia leading, but Bangladesh and others have been allies, and especially the Muslim states have been allies to that. But then again, in Southeast Asia, our neighbors, common neighbors, India, China, there's not been much happening. So again, yes, it falls on Bangladesh to make a move, but I think Bangladesh is still struggling to see which avenues would work. I mean, of course, there's at a diplomatic level, but there needs to be probably, move from all angles. If we talk about Bangladesh or their allies, both we say, the different channels.
I get your point. I get your point. So interject because I'm also running out of time. Specifically about what Professor Richards said with reference to why not take the UN agencies and other independent bodies to the island in order for them to actually see what's happening, what the infrastructure is, and how the refugees will be housed there and treated.
Thank you. As we see, Bangladesh government is being cautious about it. They have taken the local media for a trip, and this has been covered in the local national media, and maybe perhaps one or two international media which have Bengali outlets. But this may open soon. I think they're just being cautious that they want to show the picture is right. So this standoff would sort of open, and I think officially they've started to say that yes, UN agencies are open. But again, the grounds of this visit and the technicalities are not still being worked out. But officially the government stand has been very recently that yes, they're free to visit. But it's not that simple. There needs to be negotiations. And after the initial standoff, I think slowly this will open up in the next couple of months.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Asif Munier. Before I wrap up, very quickly, Professor Richards, because I'm almost run out of time. How do you see the situation unfolding? Likely some kind of resolution, some kind of external audit scrutiny of how Bangladesh is going to house the refugees on the island?
Well, far be it for me to predict the future, but I would hope that the UN gets the Bangladeshi government to allow them on the island and allow foreign media and rights groups on the island. I don't think anybody's rooting against Bangladesh here. Everybody understands how difficult the situation is. As the other guest said, Bangladesh has been promising for some time they will make the island accessible. And so I'm really hoping that they do that, and I'm hoping that they will.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. David Richards speaking with us. This is all from In Focus tonight. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.